Hello and welcome to another edition of the Iain Dale All Talk podcast. I'm Iain Dale. Today we're going to talk to somebody who's been at the top of the BBC in terms of the news organisation and the top of communications in number 10 Downing Street and played a leading role in the Brexit referendum. And he's got a new series of podcasts out with Global at the moment. It's Craig Oliver. Craig, welcome.
Hello.
Let's talk about the podcast. First of all, let's sort of do it all in reverse order. It's a really interesting idea. What's it called? Why did you want to do it?
The podcast is called Desperately Seeking Wisdom. And a couple of Christmases ago, I kind of hit the buffers. A relationship that I'd been in ended. I had a work assignment came in on the 24th of December that had to be done by the 2nd of January, which was going to completely wipe out Christmas. And it was as if like a dam inside me, which I built up over a period of time, finally felt like it was sort of cracking and about to burst. And I went through a period of like not letting it show. I was very good at not letting it show, and I got the work assignment done, and I went to...
Because you're a man, after all.
Exactly. And, but I could feel inside that the cracks were happening, and it was as if my system was suddenly being flooded by adrenaline and cortisol, those hormones that really flood through your body and have a real impact on you. And I felt like I was in a constant fight or flight mode. And it went on for a long period of time. I'd get some refuge in sleep, where I'd sleep for about 3 or 4 hours, but then I'd wake up and thoughts were going round and round and round my mind. And I felt I really should look into this. Why is this happening to me? What am I doing? Is this a pattern that's going to keep repeating itself? So I decided lockdown was starting to happen at that time, coincidentally. And I thought I have quite a lot of time not flying around the world with my job or running around London, that kind of thing. So I'm going to dedicate myself to reading a lot. And the first thing I did was look at a lot of modern thinkers, and that was really depressing because basically a lot of modern thinking is along the idea that we're a kind of cosmic joke, and we're basically an animal with a kind of overdeveloped brain, which constantly sends us on the fool's errand of trying to find meaning where there is none. So when you read that, you're kind of like, God, is that really where we've got to in terms of our thinking? But then I started coming across a lot of other people who looked at it in a different way. And a lot of modern psychology, I suppose the way I would describe it, is a kind of form of secular Buddhism or secular Hinduism. They use a lot of ideas that come from those religions, but don't take the religious aspect of it or that side of it, and basically try and apply them to people's lives and look at life differently. And through doing that, I sort of saw there is a different way of looking at life, a different way of being. I didn't have to be living life at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I could think of things very differently. And I kind of wanted to share that. And I thought when I started talking to other people about that, when I was vulnerable about it, I was surprised that people didn't sort of give me an odd look and say, have you lost it? They basically said, I've felt often the same way too. And I've got some thoughts on that. So I went through my contacts book and got in touch with quite a lot of people I know. The first podcasts are with a guy, George Alagaya, the BBC News presenter, Richard Curtis, the film director, Ruth Davidson, the politician. But also really interesting people, like the latest one that's just been released is with a guy called Bruce Perry, who's a leading neurologist and psychiatrist. And he was very good on why do we behave the way we are. And he's written a book which is called What Happened to You? And the whole premise of that book is that for millennia, we've asked the question of people who are behaving strangely or things aren't quite working or you don't quite get on with, what's wrong with you? And he said that's the wrong question. The question we should be asking is what happened to you? And when we start to understand that, we not only start to understand ourselves, we start to understand others. So the combination of all those things came together. And I was surprised that when I asked people to do it, that they said yes. And it's been pretty successful. It's had a lot of attention. A lot of people want to hear of it. And that's why I'm here today.
It sounds to me as though you indulged in a bit of self-counselling.
I think I did, really. I went and deliberately looked at where was a lot of psychology, where was a lot of thinking. There was a guy called Michael Singer who was a very, very successful businessman in the States. And he, again, sort of looked at life through this kind of slightly secular Buddhist approach. And he gave a talk that really hit me. It's a series of podcasts that are out there of him giving talks on the meaning of life, basically. And the first one is about 90 minutes long. And the first 45 minutes is the history of the universe from Big Bang to now. And when I was listening to it, I thought, this is fascinating. but I'm not really sure what it's got to do with how I live my life. And then he kind of drops a bomb. He says, so after 13.5 billion years of history and the size of the universe and everything, and you being just one person on a planet of 7.5 billion people now, what makes you think you can control anything? And what makes you think you matter? And then he follows that up quite quickly with the question of, you get to be conscious on this extraordinary planet. It's the best place in the known universe. It's got amazing animals, nature, happenings, and you get to be here, and yet you're spending all your time bitching and moaning or feeling stressed. And if you can shift your perspective away from thinking, oh my God, this is all such a terrible stress and strain and something to be got through, and start to be grateful for the sheer fact you're here, then life goes a lot easier on you. And around about that point, a very close friend of mine gave me a book by an Austrian psychiatrist called Viktor Frankl, who'd been in Auschwitz. And a couple of his family members, very close family members, were gassed. Some of them died of starvation. And he really looked into it afterwards and said that he was interested in that the people who had seen that there was a point and purpose, even in the worst moments of humanity, were the ones that actually thrived and prospered more. And he did a lot of research in, basically, can you see the world for all its joy and wonder, even though you might experience incredibly difficult things? And I sort of thought, well, if you can do it, and you've been through what you've been through, then surely I can. And so I started trying to do basic things that were suggested, like exercise, about trying to think about the things that you're grateful for, making sure that I exercised each day, making sure that, I try to observe things, try to be in the present moment. They're quite well-known things, but actually if you put them together in a combination and work at them, I found they really worked for me. And when I spoke to other people who'd done it as well, they found that too.
Because often when you're in a high-pressure job, you forget about all of that sort of thing, because you're literally moving from minute to minute. You're busy, 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 busy. No time for relaxation, no time for anything apart from the job. And you were in two jobs that demanded everything from you.
And I think that's a really interesting point. Why are you doing that? Why are you in those jobs, and why are you treating them in that way, so that your whole day is flooded completely with busyness? And why is it that when you stop, that maybe you feel anxious, uncertain, certain things that are inside you that you haven't dealt with? And that was another thing that became very clear to me. When you speak to experts in this, what I was basically doing was that my drug was filling my days, being incredibly busy, and pushing away a lot of stuff that had happened to me in my past. Now, some of that was in my career, like, I'd been in some pretty brutal fights and environments and that kind of thing. And some of that was from my childhood. There was a lot of stuff in my childhood that I'd basically not dealt with. And I kind of concreted it all over. And I was known as the person in my career that, was capable of, like, everything's suddenly changes at 1 minute to 10 and you change the entire BBC 10 o'clock news and you can get through it. I could do that and it worked. Or in Number 10, I was capable of sometimes just putting my foot on the ball and say, right, let's all just stop and work out how we're going to deal with this. And that was my kind of a persona and approach. And I was running around and chasing things and doing things. But it was really a way of avoiding facing things. There's a film called Bohemian Rhapsody, which everybody probably listening to this has seen. I am nothing like Freddie Mercury, but I think that in the film there's something that he says that's very interesting. He talks about the moments in between, those moments where you actually have to stop and look at yourself and live with yourself and be with yourself. And those are moments that I realized that millions and millions of people are very uncomfortable, and because they haven't really focused on things that they find difficult. And you have a choice, really. You can keep pushing and you can do workaholism, which was my thing, or, some people it's drugs or alcohol or sex or shopping or whatever. Or you can actually try and stop and look at it and deal with it.
But it was a form of depression.
It was. It's funny, I didn't ever feel, there was never a moment where I just thought, I can't get myself out of bed. I can't deal with this. But I do remember, having said that, I do remember there were moments where I was editing the BBC's main TV news programmes or in Downing Street, standing in the shower and really pulling myself up to say, you're going to go out there and face another day. And there's nothing, like the job of being director of communications at Downing Street, look, I asked for it. I did it, and it was a great job, and there were amazing things, and I wouldn't complain about it. And it is right that governments are held to account. I'm not whinging or complaining about that at all. But it is a relentless, brutal thing where a lot of people are paid to test you or trip you up or make you, under extreme pressure and see what happens. And doing that for 6 years, and particularly doing that for 6 years, which then ended up in the Brexit referendum where we're in the trenches at the end, out of ammunition, being overrun by the enemy, and seeing people that I genuinely cared about having their careers destroyed, again, my choice, the place I was in, I'm not complaining about it at all. But that sort of stuff does stuff to you, so you probably need to process it.
But also, and I've had a couple of these moments in my life where I've been 24/7 for a period of time, and then suddenly it's all taken away from you. I mean, just adjusting mentally to being director of communications at one point, and then the next day, after David Cameron left office, you had lost your job, all of your colleagues had lost theirs as well, and just adapting to having to find something to do for the rest of the day.
Yeah,
that's difficult, isn't it?
It is, and I look at what I did. So I was offered to write a book, and so I snapped at the idea, and they said, we need you to write this in less than 3 months, and it's coming out in October, and that kind of thing. And so I basically picked up my laptop and spent the next 3 months writing this book, and that was another way of filling my time with loads of things.
But it also presumably slightly delayed processing what had happened.
No, exactly right. And I think that I probably too quickly went into another job and career, filled my days again, was flying around the world, flying around London and the UK, doing lots of stuff. And again, it was a way of blocking it out and not having to face up to certain things on your own. And then there's a moment, I think, where your mind and body sort of starts giving you a nudge and a kick and saying, hang on a minute, this isn't working. You have built this dam that's been very successful and worked for a long period of time, but the cracks are starting to show, and you can either address this or you can do more of the same.
Do you feel a need to be seen to be successful?
I think I probably do. I'm not so much anymore since I've done a lot of this stuff, but I think I did. I think I needed to justify myself and feel like it was my way of getting people to say, that's good, or you're clever or special or whatever. And also the jobs that I was attracted to, somebody pointed out to me quite often, was I was speaking for somebody else, or fighting for something else, or very high pressure environments where I felt the need to expose myself to that, which is good once in a while, but doing it from the beginning of your career right the way through, it's probably not the best way of going about things.
Do you think you're a nicer person now? And the reason I ask that is because I relate it. When I have a house in Norfolk, and when I spend time in Norfolk, I think I'm a nicer person because I'm out of this rat race.
I think it's a very good question. I think that there were moments where in those times, I hope people would look back and say that I was kind and generous. But I also think that there are certain things about the job, for example, of being director of communications at Number 10. There were times where you have to go into a fight and it's like knuckle dusters and knives. And, let's be frank, there are certain aspects of the media who will not always play fair. So you have to be able to handle yourself in those circumstances, which means you find yourself in certain situations and behaving a certain way. It's funny, a few members of the lobby that I've remained friends of tell me stories about a couple of things where I got into rows and fights, and I'm slightly cringing at the thought of listening. One of the newspapers, I won't say who it was, basically broke an embargo, and I was getting off a bus in Boston, and I walked up to this person who'd only just started on that newspaper and said, tell your editor he's a total and he won't get anything else from me for a very long time, and walked off. And he tells the story of the assembled lobby journalists just like, God, what got into him? And you sort of look back and you think, God, maybe you should have left that one. Maybe that wasn't such a great way of behaving.
Over the past few days, I've told various people I'm interviewing you, and every single one of them has said, have you listened to his interview with George Alagaya? This is one of the best interviews I've ever heard. Just talk to us about that, because I think for people who haven't ever listened to your podcast, I mean, it is the first one, and it's a great introduction. I mean, you kind of hit the jackpot, didn't you, with that?
I did. I like to think we did. There's a team behind it that I've sort of been working.
You have a team on podcasts?
Well, it's a very, very small team. But I knew George from working at the BBC, and present company accepted. There's a fair degree of narcissism in presenters quite often.
Oh, no, I completely own up to it.
But not in George. And he's an extraordinarily successful guy who I always thought was incredibly balanced and centred. And then 7 years ago, he got told he was in sort his affairs out territory with bowel cancer.
Yeah.
And I thought that he would be fascinating to talk to, because how had he experienced that? What had he learned? And so talk to him about going there. And it was literally the first interview that we did. And we were in his room in his house in London for 3 hours. And I wanted to do something that was a conversation, not an interview. And I also wanted to do something where we talked about stuff that people didn't normally talk about. So towards the end of the interview, it's not 3 hours, the podcast. The podcast is cut down to about 50 minutes, but there is a good 10-minute section in there where we talk about death. Now, that is not something that a lot of people want to talk about. But I thought it was really important too, because where is the conversation about that? Something, it's the one thing we're all going to face, and it's maybe the one thing that we all sort of push away, and it's the one thing that's really staring him in the face. Some of the thinkers that I've been reading, there's a guy called Eckhart Tolle who says that it's almost illegal in the West to see a dead body. It's almost impossible to actually be aware of it, despite the fact that people are dying all the time. And it means that we never really focus on the one thing that we know is going to happen to us. So I wanted to talk to him about that. The other thing that I think that people have really reacted to in the interview, and by the way, he says that it forced him to look at his life and say, despite everything, it was worth it. But the thing that had really upset him was that he's incredibly close to his wife. And it's really lovely to hear somebody who has a real soulmate. But the thing that devastated him when he was diagnosed was that he wasn't going to make it to the end with Fran. And he'd built his life and his relationship on the assumption that would happen and should happen. And I think it's really interesting, those words, would and should. We make all sorts of assumptions about our lives, and we believe that certain things should be a certain way. And I talk to him a lot about that, because actually things just are. They're not should be's, they just are. And it was good to talk to him about that, and I think a lot of people reacted to that as well, like that. A close friend of mine who I haven't interviewed for the podcast, but who I know very well's father died just before Christmas. And we were talking about how upset he was, and he said, the reason I'm upset is because I should have had a better relationship with him, and I wasn't close to him, and I'm mourning the fact that I didn't have that, and I shouldn't be. And I said, we both agreed at the end of that conversation that the word should is probably the most toxic in the English language, because we force ourselves to believe that certain things should be the way they are, and they sometimes just aren't. And we beat ourselves up about it, and we feel a lot of tension and pain because of it. And I think a lot of people, when you start talking to them about those things, they kind of like, God, why wasn't I able to talk about that before? Why couldn't we talk about that before? And why don't we talk about that? And why are we embarrassed? And I think that was my main thing. Actually doing the podcast, I really wondered, are people going to think this guy's really lost it? Has he just become some weird hippie loon who's just completely lost it? But what's fascinating is that actually people have said, it's great that you're talking about those things and talking to people who are genuinely interesting about them.
And you're right, on the subject of death and grief, there aren't many places to talk about it. And I know when my first real experience was, I suppose, when my mother died in 2012. And it was, I mean, she was dying over a period of a few months, and I would disappear from the programme from time to time. And the week after she died, I did a phone-in on grief, which my producers did not think was a good idea, given that I have a tendency to cry very easily at anything. But I found over the years that doing that sort of subject, and I do it reasonably regularly now. If there's a news hook for it, I'll immediately do it, because I know that there are people out there that want to talk about it and have no opportunity to, no outlet, because their family won't talk about it. And people will phone up, and if they trust you as a presenter, and I think this is where you struck gold with George, and that he clearly trusted you, you can get the most amazing stories from people. Yeah. And they will volunteer. They've never phoned a radio station in their life. They've never talked to anyone else about it. And it can be incredibly moving. And it almost gives other people permission to talk about it.
And I think it's interesting listening to you, your sharing probably helped you face it and deal with it and process it. And I think that's...
I was okay until about 45 minutes in, when David Dagenham phoned in and he said, "I can hear it in your voice."
Oh. But I think that was the other thing that became clear to me, is a lot of modern psychology is about how do you actually process those feelings that are inside you, because if they're inside you and blocked, then you almost create a kind of whole lifestyle and way of dealing with things to avoid the pain. And the big piece of advice is to actually sit with it and let it pass through you and feel it. And that is actually very counterintuitive to people, because you don't like feeling it. You don't like the pain, so you push it away. But actually, when you do push it away, it sort of magnifies and amplifies, or big moments in your life send you careening off course, because there's this blockage there, and there's this thing you haven't really dealt with.
But also, when you don't feel what you think you ought to be feeling, I think that's even worse in a way.
And it's that should point,
yeah,
isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's exactly what I was saying. It's like that we feel that there should be another person in our life that we can subcontract all our emotional problems to. If you think, I was talking to Richard Curtis about this, was that, his films and a lot of romantic comedies and virtually all pop music are about this idea of the one out there who's going to make you feel great. And we talked about how actually later in life he shifted away from that and started writing about stuff that was different to that. And I also think that we do have a society. I was listening as I came up with the idea of the podcast. There was this self-help kind of podcast that was, I think BBC Sounds was actually doing, where somebody was talking about, we all know that if we all just try really hard, we can achieve whatever we want. And it's just a case of putting in that extra effort. And I'm going to be interviewing this gold medalist who's done this, that, and the other. And I'm not saying that, you shouldn't put effort and energy into what you want and that kind of thing. But that is exactly the wrong message to send to people. It is wrong, but it is incredibly prevalent in our society. And I do think it creates a lot of people who feel deep disappointment in their own lives, when actually, if you can shift your perspective towards, isn't it amazing that I get to be here and conscious and seeing and doing this sort of stuff, then you start feeling happier.
And was that the first time you'd really been behind the microphone? In that
it was.
Kind of
I'd always been. I'd done a bit of reporting. There are a couple of embarrassing examples on YouTube of me early in my career reporting. I'd done a little bit, but quite early on, I realised that I liked the idea of being at the centre of things all the time. And if you're an editor of a TV news programme, you'll bet every day you're the one that gets to make choices and commission things and do things. And I really liked that. And it didn't really bother me that I wasn't famous for it. I liked that I could do that. And then actually quite fairly late into my career, I actually spent 13 years at ITN, and then I'd spent 5 years at the BBC. Completely out of the blue, I got a call from Downing Street saying, would you be interested in coming and talking about being the director of communications? And they say that curiosity killed the cat. I was on this successful career at the BBC. And then I thought, God, I would always be thinking what would have happened if I hadn't done that. So I took the leap. And
were you confident that you could do it? I mean, because obviously it was going to be something very, very different to what you'd been used to, and you knew that you'd become a bit of a public figure, and not everyone would have welcomed that.
So I don't know that I completely thought of it in that terms. I did not know what I was letting myself in for. The experience is a bit like being picked up off the riverbank and being thrown into the Whitewater Rapids. So from second one that you are there, you are expected to do the job. Now, in any normal work environment, you'd have an induction period or whatever, and you don't.
And you had it was a difficult time because you were taking over from Andy Coulson.
It was.
Who ended up in jail.
It was a difficult time going into Downing Street, and there was a team that were understandably and rightly very loyal to Andy, who'd been very shaken by what had happened to him. I was, at the same time, David Cameron and George Osborne had taken the opportunity to try and shift away from the print bias. There'd never been anybody who'd done that job who hadn't been from a print background. And so David Cameron would just go around saying, isn't it wonderful? I've got this guy who understands broadcasting and digital, and it's amazing, and whatever. And I eventually had to say to him, will you shut up? Because the people who are really powerful in the lobby are the print people, and they hate it every time you say that.
Yeah, and they did accuse you of just caring about the 10 o'clock news, didn't they?
They did, and I think that's kind of inevitable. And I think, to be honest, I think that showed their insecurity more than mine. The reality was, we were on the frontier of massive changes in media at the time. So I think that the Westminster Village had been in about 1958 in terms of obsession with print. And it was finally waking up to the idea that there was this thing called the radio and the television, just as there was an explosion in digital. So it was very backward in terms of its dealings with media. So shunting it away from the thing that it was comfortable with was very hard. And I think, look, I made some mistakes in that, and I pushed hard sometimes when I perhaps should have been maybe not tried so hard. But I after about 6 months of being knocked about and thrown around in the Whitewater Rapids, you finally work out how to orientate yourself, and then you're set, and it works, and it's okay. But I suppose my way of dealing with it was, I'm going to do a triathlon every day. And that probably long term was not the best thing for me.
Do you think that you're generally a very confident person? Have you ever suffered from imposter syndrome?
It's funny. I think that it's possible to be, we are lots of different people at lots of different times. I think that, in certain circumstances, I present and am capable of being very confident, and in other circumstances feel an imposter, not certain, worried, confused, anxious. And I think that...
Give us an instance of that.
Well, I think in my public life, if somebody says to me, look, go and stand on that stage and speak for 5 minutes about something, I can do it. Or you have to go... I found that I could go in and shut the door and say to the Prime Minister, you really, really are going to have to face this, and I know it's difficult, and I know you probably want to shout at me, but we have to do this. So those kind of things I always felt okay about. Actually, I think it was more in terms of my private life and other things that I was less good, less strong, less confident and uncertain. And a lot of that is really down to my childhood. And I made a decision when I was doing this podcast that, because, people are alive and there's people I care about and, lots of complicated things, not to really go in much more detail than that, to sort of say that but not really delve too deep. But it meant that in those moments in between that I was talking about earlier was when I felt anxious, uncertain, worried, not that confident. And I think that sometimes that manifested itself myself in getting into fights, rows, arguments that probably weren't worth the energy and effort that they took.
Given the jobs that you've had, do you think that they impacted really negatively on your private life?
Yeah, look, I think that there is no way that I wasn't sure of a way of doing being at number 10 Downing Street without it being consuming. There was never a day where I was off. I slept with not one phone but two phones on next to my bed, because the truth is and that's a terrible way to do any job. But I do think that job is a bit of an exception, because if in the modern media environment, if the Prime Minister phones you up and says, I need an answer, you better be able to give it now, or if not now, very quickly. Otherwise, things fall apart.
And how often did that 3 a.m. phone call come?
There were a few examples that I sort of remember. The one that I really remember, just like is absolutely ingrained in my mind, is when Oliver Letwin, who I think is a genuinely brilliant man, who I love very much and like very much, but he took it upon himself to go into the leader of the opposition's office and negotiate about the phone hacking inquiry.
I remember.
And I got a call very late at night, and it was the number 10 switchboard was very quickly able to get people together pre-Zoom and everything and have a sort of call. And it was clear that Oliver had decided to wander into Ed Miliband's office and was negotiating. And I was like, I'm really not happy about this. This does not feel right. And then 2 hours later, there was another phone call, and it said, it's all done. There's been a deal done. We've all agreed. We're on great ground. But the thing that we've all agreed is that nobody is to brief the press on our side. We've agreed that's very clear. And I said, are you nuts? That, the idea that the Labour Party isn't on the phone to the Today programme at this very second, giving them every detail of what happened and why they're geniuses. So, and I was ordered very clearly, look, you've got to trust the man on the spot. Oliver's been there. That's what he's agreed. We're sticking to it. So I didn't go to sleep for the next few hours and turned on the news at 6 a.m. And the first sort of half hour of the Today programme was why the Labour Party were all complete geniuses, and number 10 were full of complete morons who didn't know what they were doing, briefing about...
So a normal day then?
Briefings about Oliver's trousers, which were mustard-coloured cords. I remember that detail. And I remember, just within seconds of that happening, it was in the very early days of Twitter, basically... a thing appearing on Twitter that I was toast because the handling of the communications of this has been so idiotic. And I felt really, you have to have a kind of collective responsibility at that moment. But there was part of me that really just wanted to go out and said I was very clear that this was a stupid idea. Interestingly, I think, since David Cameron's government, people don't do that anymore. Everybody's talking all the time. And it's astonishing to the degree to which you see people just commentating on everything and anything every time. And the idea that you might want to be discreet, or that things might actually be more sensible if you allowed them to develop before you actually did something, seems to have been completely disappeared from British politics.
Well, it's only 5 years since you left Downing Street, but in a sense, the whole media world has transformed since then, sort of with social media in particular, but also the broadcast environment, where the broadcasting round now has doubled in size because you've got all the different new media outlets, so GB News, Times Radio, Talk Radio.
I don't think it's changed that much, in the sense that I think that the explosion of social media had really occurred by the time that I left Downing Street, and there were new kids on the blocks. You're right that there is now a Times Radio and all the great stuff the Global's doing and all this kind of stuff, and a plethora of more media. I don't think that that's the point, though. I think that the point is that we have moved away from governments feeling like they have a period of governing and delivery. And it feels to me like we're almost in a stage where it's a constant campaign and a constant commentary on a campaign, as if just the sheer act of announcing something means that it's done. And I was talking about this to some students the other day, and I was trying to develop the idea. And it seemed to me that in 1945 or in 1979, two very, very different governments, but both big reforming governments, came in. And there was an understanding that after winning, that there would have to be a period of governing and delivery, and that was going to mean deep unpopularity or people having to go away. And then there would be a moment towards the end where you're back into campaigning and that works. We seem to be now in a constant campaign, I think. And I think that's quite problematic and worrying. And there's lots of reasons for that, but I think probably the main one is the explosion of social media and the instantaneous nature of it, and the fact that lots and lots and lots of people can speak and let things be known to lots and lots and lots of different outlets, and it can cause complete mayhem.
When you were in Number 10, there was sort of a lot of Conservatives were rather concerned that you weren't actually a Conservative.
Yes. Well, I mean, look, that's not a bad question to ask, actually, because I was no, when I felt when I was asked to do the job, I wasn't sure if it was.
Why do you think
me.
they picked you?
I think they picked me because they'd just gone through a period of scandal with the previous person. They wanted somebody who would be clean, to be honest. And there wasn't going to be a sense that there was going to be that. And I also think that they were desperate to have somebody who understood broadcast and digital. And so I seemed to tick both of those boxes. And then I went and I remember on a Sunday morning going and having a conversation with George Osborne in his house, and then going to Chequers and meeting the Prime Minister. And I think we sort of clicked, and they saw.
Had you ever met them before?
I had been in meetings with them and, talked to them, but we'd never really had a proper sort of social interaction. But in answer to your question, that if you are in broadcasting and an editor of a big programme that gets a lot of attention, you are damn sure that that programme is going to be impartial, because if it's not, people are going to ask a lot of questions. And as a result of that, you become quite monkish about your own politics. It's not something that's front and centre in your life, in the sense that, it's core to who you are. So I'd gone through a long period of trying to be impartial. Yes, I voted and that kind of thing, but I didn't think I am of the Conservative tribe. And I think people could smell that on me. But I don't think that
Did they actually ask you that in those meetings?
David Cameron asked me if I'd voted for him, and I was able to say yes. I wasn't able to say that I'd always voted Conservative.
Because I think I think for anybody who comes into the party, okay, you weren't party political in the normal sense of the phrase, but you were there to sell the Prime Minister who was a Conservative, and that inevitably must be quite a difficult thing to adjust to.
A little bit. I mean, you're definitely through the looking glass. So the thing that I realised quite early on, I think journalists are often very unimaginative about what the people in power are going through. And one of the first things you realise when you go to Number 10 is there's an awful lot of them and not very many of you. There's actually a very, very small core team who are responsible for things. Again, not complaining, but sometimes it can feel like you're completely surrounded by an awful lot of people. And they say, oh, but you've got the machinery of government. That is an impartial civil service that is paid to do the government's bidding, but it is not in any way a sort of campaigning machine for you. And ultimately, it is just down to this very small group of people. And I also think that it struck me quite clearly how often the decisions that land on a Prime Minister's desk are really knotty, complex, difficult. Very often you have imperfect information, you have very limited information, but everybody expects you to make a decision. Very often you know that your decision will cause harm, but it's just less harm than the other one that you think will happen. And I think that quite often you feel inside Number 10 is anybody really understanding that? And of course then you realise, look, it's my job to try and explain, and it's my job to try and to help people understand. But I do think that we have got ourselves into a situation which is becoming more and more stark, of everything being black and white. It's left or right, up or down, stark. And we have lost the capacity to often look at things and say it's a complex, nuanced situation. One of the things that's been going on in British politics at the moment is how the government is dealing with the Partygate. As we're recording this, it's dealing with, how is it dealing with the parties in Number 10? And it seems to me that one of the reasons why the government is making such a mess of it is because they weren't willing to explain themselves earlier on. They just simply took a very stark position, built a wall and said it's that, And that has caused them endless problems when early on, if they had gone out there, suggested there is some mitigation, said, look, we got it very badly wrong, we are sorry, I suspect they could have moved on. And instead, they're in this kind of like endless pain.
Do your successors ever call you up and say, look, we're thinking of doing this, what do you reckon? Or do you ever volunteer advice to them?
I don't volunteer advice. I have been contacted about doing stuff. I suppose the most interesting example is when I was asked what I thought about doing daily on-camera press briefings. And my instant reaction was, everybody considers this, you think about it for 5 minutes and you realise it's going to be a complete disaster, don't do it. And I was slightly amazed to see that the studio was built for £2.5 million. And the reality is that the particular environment that we're in the UK, it was never going to work. On a day where it's boring, nobody's going to want to run it. And on a day when the government's in trouble, they're going to run it massively. And even the rehearsals turned out to be a complete car crash that resulted in somebody resigning. Can you imagine Partygate with a daily on the record press? I mean, just a nightmare. So my advice was sought on that one, and it was ignored.
At a cost of £2.5 million.
Yes.
Tell us about the sort of day-to-day running of the job, because I think all governments, all press officers in Downing Street, communications directors, they're human beings. They've got people that they like in the lobby, they've got people they don't like, and they've got people that they trust are going to give them a fair hearing. Did you find initially that quite a challenge to work out, well, who do I trust here?
So we took a decision very early on, and I think people look back at our team, and we wanted to be professional. We wanted to never be ever accused of lying to people, and we also wanted to have a relationship with the people who were our political enemies. So I would talk to the Guardian journalists and the Mirror journalists and was able to pick up the phone to them and talk to them. And I knew that quite often they were going to turn us over in the paper, but we took a view that it was better to have good, friendly relationships across the piece. And of course, then there are political decisions that you make of giving a story to somebody who you know is going to make a big impact with it, or is actually going to give you a fairer wind on it. Of course, your job is to basically help communicate what the government's doing and ultimately get it re-elected. So you do that. I think that there has, again, since the advent of people like Steve Bannon and Dominic Cummings and what they've introduced into politics, it has become much more tribal, much more aggressive, and I think that we are seeing that the system almost can't take it because it had become so bitter and divisive and difficult. And hopefully, to mix my metaphors, the pendulum will swing back.
You said we're recording this in January 2022. Who knows what's going to have happened by the time some people listen to this in 2025? But when you look at the way that the Boris Johnson administration is handling its communications, I mean, it's a car crash, isn't it? I can't think of any other phrase to describe it. From day to day, they just make the most basic of errors.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because a few months ago from the recording of this podcast in January 2022, Boris Johnson walked on water. He could do no wrong. I was at the Conservative Party conference, I'm sure you were, and there were no challengers. He was just king of all he surveyed. And then progressively over the subsequent weeks, there have been a number of unforced errors that I think have got repeat patterns in them. And I think that the repeat pattern is, are you willing early on to say, this is a mistake, this is a problem, we are going to have to take pain and show weakness, but in taking some pain and showing some weakness now, we will at least draw a line and be able to move on. They, for whatever reason, seem incapable of doing that. And I don't understand why. It may be that people don't feel able to go into the Prime Minister's office and tell him we've got to stop. It may be that he's not listening. But they keep doing it. And I think that ultimately that will be at a very, very great cost to all of them. I don't know when it's going to happen or how it's going to happen, but that has resulted in a complete unnecessary car crash, as you say.
How long did it take you after the Brexit referendum to sort of get that out of your head? Because that consumed for the last, presumably the last year or so of the Cameron government, that must have consumed not every waking hour, but quite a lot of it. And you had a pretty rough press at the end of that. I mean, you were seen by some as the fall guy for the fact that the Remain didn't win, which I thought was a bit unfair at the time. And then you wrote a book about it, and then it all sort of multiplied in a sense.
It's an interesting period. So definitely there was at least a 3-year period where there was not a day where somebody somewhere did not say to me, why did David Cameron call a referendum on Europe? And I just became like very adept at trying to explain to people what had happened. I did take a decision early on to explain what had happened. I mean, bizarrely for me, I had, as we talked about, I was never involved in politics. I certainly never thought I'd be fighting in a European referendum campaign. When it was announced that we were doing it, I was like, wow. And then David Cameron said to me in the Christmas of 2015, a New Year, this is going wrong. You're going to have to go over there with a couple of other people and sort it out. And retrospectively, I think in many ways we'd already lost by then, but I then had a 6-month period in it. I was by no means the leader of that campaign. I was one of a series of people who were leading it. But afterwards, I went out and thought, I want to talk about this and defend it, and then looked around and saw that the others were nowhere to be seen. That meant that I went through a pain barrier. So I went and did some quite interesting interviews where people were amazingly aggressive. It was fascinating to see. You know, I don't mind. And I think I've looked back at a couple of them and think I acquitted myself fine, but you know, they were very, very aggressive, and a lot of people felt very pain. And because I was the one that was there and available, I took a lot of heat. But the result of that, I think, was that because I took that heat, there was a moment where then people started saying, well, you came out and faced the music and you did it, and it's fine. And now I have very, very good relationships with the media. You're a Brexiteer. Understand why you were that. Don't really have a problem with that. I disagree with you profoundly. I think it's been a big mistake, but I also have a good relationship with you and want to have that relationship with you and want to be able to have that discussion and that debate and lose that debate and move on and be human with each other. And I think that there was definitely a period where it felt like the country couldn't have the debate and move on. And a lot of that was down to the people who succeeded.
And that hasn't entirely disappeared, I don't think, even 5 years on.
From my personal experience, I think it's getting better. I mean, I don't think people are. I mean, there was a period where there was nothing other than Brexit, literally nothing other. It just dominated, and it was agony. That, you know, the Theresa May premiership, I think, was an agonising experience, not just for the people in Number 10, but you know, for the country. And it was a massive psychodrama, and it was a nightmare. I do think we have started to move on, but I do worry that there was, and this isn't a Brexit point, and it isn't they're awful and we were great point, but there has been something that happened in developed Western democracies where poison was injected into the system, and we are still struggling to deal with that poison. And I do think that one of the issues that I had with the Leave campaign, and this is not to say they're awful and we were great, but one of the things that I thought was an issue with them was that they believed that the means were justified by the ends. And so it felt to me that sometimes some of the damage that they were causing...
The other way around, you mean? The ends were justified by the means?
No, I don't mean that. I mean that they justified the tactics that they had because they were fighting a cause, that they thought at the end that Brexit was going to be the great thing that delivered for the country. And therefore, all's fair in love and war, you can do what you want. And actually, some of the tactics, I just think caused a lot of damage and poison and mistrust and agonies. And I think that what I find worrying about a certain breed of politicians, which is on both sides, by the way, I think there are certain Remainers who will not let go, are unbelievably tribal, can't forgive, you know. And
but that's enough about Alistair Campbell.
and others. And you're just like, at what point are you going to stop, guys? And actually, by the way, I mean, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Seem remarkably similar to a type of breed of politician on the other side to me. They seem to me to have far more in common with each other than they would find comfortable to admit.
I think zealots are unhealthy on whatever the argument is.
I think that's true.
I mean, if you were somebody who had, from 1973, like Bill Cash, always thought the European Economic Community, then the European Union, was an intrinsically bad thing, I can understand why you would be euphoric. I could understand why you could be very tribal. I could understand why you might think that the ends justify the means. But for I think the overwhelming majority of ordinary Leave voters, they weren't like that.
No,
they became Leave voters for different reasons, it has to be said. I mean, I didn't make up my mind until after the Brussels summit in, whenever it was, February 2016, where I just thought they're never going to reform. They are never going to change. And they will get a United States of Europe at some time. I don't think we should be part of that. And that was my logic.
And recording, I mean, I'm genuinely interested in recording this now in January 2022. Do you feel entirely comfortable you made the right decision?
I don't regret my vote. I think there have been lots of things that have been mishandled since then. I always said and I never actually revealed how I was voting until after the referendum, which is, everyone thinks I was one of the big cheerleaders.
Everybody remembers you as a...
Everyone thinks I was alongside Farage, sort of arguing for it. I wasn't at all, because I thought, if I'm interviewing people on both sides of this debate, I can't take part in it. Now, as soon as it was over, and I think it was actually on the referendum night programme, I said, well, I voted Leave. And there was almost a collective, which people had seen my social media, they probably wouldn't have been surprised, but I had genuinely not said anything on air. I don't think it's been a failure. I think there have been difficulties, and I will probably admit slightly more difficulties in some areas than I thought there should have been. I mean, the Northern Ireland thing, I think, has been an absolute disgrace.
Two things. I mean, I remember we asked Tony Blair and John Major to go to Northern Ireland, and I remember just being either ignored or mocked, and that was extraordinary. It's like, that we were warning about this. That's just another scare tactic. But the thing that there's a quote, and I wish I could remember it verbatim, which I put at the front of my book, Unleashing Demons, which is from Boris Johnson, where he talks about a kind of strange psychology that was going on that wasn't about Brexit, and he compares it to Diana when she died. It wasn't really about that, but it was a moment where it's almost like we pulled up the stone and saw what was underneath, all the pains and difficulties, and that was the thing that I don't think David Cameron realised, that it was going to be a kind of lightning conductor for all sorts of things.
And it did split the country in ways that I'd never experienced before, and I think it still has. And okay, you can say those wounds are gradually healing, but I'll never forget the day, it was probably within a week of the referendum, when I went to see my dad and my sisters. And my dad had always been he was a farmer, he was always anti the EU. And my sisters had somehow persuaded him to vote Remain, which I thought was a bit wrong of them. And they said, well, you have ruined our children's lives. Come on. And that's, we didn't not speak after that or anything. It wasn't like that, but some families didn't speak to each other, still aren't speaking to each other. Friendships were broken over it.
And I think that one of the things, and there's all sorts of reasons for this, and we could spend weeks talking about it, is the extent to which that division exists, and how our media debate is in terms of people shouting at each other and being the most extraordinarily personal and excoriating and brutal about making assumptions about other people. And it's astonishing. And taking it back to the podcast, what I think is really interesting is, here is a space for people to talk about difficult things and be open and honest. And I haven't really seen any negativity towards it. And people have actually said that they really welcome it and want it. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Is that how is it that our media has become this, place where people screaming and shouting at each other. I made the mistake at a dinner party of trying to make the point that I could see both sides in the transgender debate.
Never go there.
Boy, did I regret it. I mean, it was just like, and literally I was like, can I finish a sentence? Am I allowed to even express what I think here? But people had thought that.
But it's not all like that. I mean, yes, there is lots more shoutiness now. But the fact that you and I have been speaking now for an hour, where could we really do that in the old media days? We could never have done that. And I mean, constantly on this podcast, I did one with Andrew Adonis a couple of weeks ago, and we did spend a bit of time talking about Brexit. And I've had so many people say, well, I saw him in a completely different light because he wasn't this sort of shouty Twitter figure.
And I think that that's really interesting and encouraging, and that actually the new forms of communication like podcasts are allowing spaces like that. And what was interesting is that there's somebody who's helping produce the podcast, who had worked for the BBC for a very long time. And there was a moment where I said, look, that's not what I want to do. I'm not trying to get a story out of this person. I'm not trying to put pressure on them. I want to hear them talk and be in conversation and feel able to be open. So I hope you're right. I hope that, as you know, this allows a kind of environment where that is much more the case. Having said that, I do think that the big beasts of media at the moment are not those places. So as we're recording this, I know somebody who has something to do with Question Time, which is asking for people who are anti-vaxxers to come on and talk, and you're just like,
I saw that last week, and I just thought, how can you possibly say that?
But where does that come from? And it's sort of, to me, it feels like that decision is not really about understanding. It's more to do with, let's have a bit of instant controversy. And anybody who's been on Question Time, I think, knows that it is set up for a fight, and it's about how can you knock somebody out and scar them as much as possible. That is a leading debating programme in the UK, and it's not healthy and it's not helpful.
No, and it's a programme that I find I do watch it most weeks because I'm in a hotel room before I do Good Morning Britain the next day. That's the only reason I watch it. And every week I think I'm never watching this again.
Well, I can recommend that I won't say what they were, but one of the things that I was able to do when I left Downing Street was have a media detox. And there were certain things that I never have to deal with ever again and feel so much better for.
I've done it a couple of times, and I actually enjoyed the first one because it was an adult panel, it was an adult audience, and this was right in the middle of all the Brexit shenanigans, and it was an actual pleasure to be on it. The next time they had 6 panellists. Yeah. And of course, I then wrote an article in the Telegraph saying this is not how you should conduct a political debate. I think I had 3 minutes of the 60. You can say, well, that's my fault, but I just wasn't going to indulge in this sort of dogfight. And so I wrote this article. This was in September 2019. Have I been invited back since? No, I haven't, and I couldn't give a toss.
Interesting. But no, I think that the big point is, can we get to a stage where we are exploring things, and what are we really arguing about, and what are the things that are really going on here? Because I think that actually Boris Johnson's insight was that it wasn't really about the European Union, and I think that's right.
I think it's partly right, yeah. There were lots of things going into that.
Yeah.
Well, I like to think in these podcasts that we've had the type of conversation that if we were in a bar, we would have probably had. And I think we probably have had in some ways. I think it's been very personal, and thank you for being so open. And best of luck with the podcast. Desperately Seeking Wisdom, Global Player, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Exactly. And thank you for having me.
Great, thank you. Well, join us again next time on the Iain Dale, I nearly said the Iain Dale Book Club podcast, which I just did. Iain Dale All Talk this time. Thank you and goodbye.